Good evening and welcome to the Australian Society for Computers and Law's first Distinguished Speakers Address on Technology, Competition and Multilateralism. We are joined by colleagues from across the globe and pay our respects to each of the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. For me, here in Sydney, Australia, I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. A particular welcome to all First Nations people joining us today. The Australian Society for Computers and Law is a vibrant community of academics, legal and IT professionals, policymakers and leaders in civil society. It is our mission to champion an interdisciplinary approach to discussing and addressing critical issues at the intersection of technology, law and society. A big thank you to the global law firm bird&bird and the Institute for Patent and Trademark Attorneys for supporting tonight's event. Also, on behalf of the Society and its members, I thank each of our speakers for sharing their time and expertise. Tonight, it is our privilege to hear a keynote address from the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization, the Director General Francis Gurry. He joins us all the way from Geneva and will be followed by an exceptional panel of Australian leaders moderated by Dr. Jed Horner from Standards Australia. Jed will introduce each of our panellists after Francis's address. We're keen to answer as many questions as possible and ask that you include those in the chat function. At the conclusion of the panel session, Shane Barber, the Managing Partner of bird&bird, will provide final comments and a formal vote of thanks. Now to introduce our keynote speaker. Francis Gurry is the Director General of the World Intellectual Property Organization and has served in that role with distinction for the last 12 years. He is an Australian lawyer and holds degrees from the University of Melbourne, a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and is an honorary professor and holds honorary doctorates from multiple universities across the globe. He is the author of a number of publications, including Gurry on Breach of Confidence, published by Oxford University Press, and the co-author of International Intellectual Property in an Integrated World Economy. Francis Gurry is an inspiration to many. As Australia's most senior United Nations diplomat, his achievements are too many to list now, but they include helping establish the WIPO Arbitration and Mediation Centre and leading initiatives in the protection of traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expression, and genetic resources. Today, we will explore the interplay of technology, competition, and multilateralism, a critical topic as we collectively face unprecedented challenges from global pandemics, a threatened ecosystem, and technological advances which far outpace needed legislative reform. Francis Gurry, thank you for joining us tonight. I will now hand over to you.
Marina, thank you very much for your overly generous introduction. It's really a pleasure to join you from Geneva this morning. It's a beautiful morning in Geneva. Thank you, first of all, to the Australian Society for Computers and the Law for organising this event. Thank you to bird&bird for hosting it. Thank you to Jed for chairing. Thank you to all the extremely distinguished panellists who are extremely tolerant because they're going to be commenting on a paper that they haven't seen. And thank you, everyone who is listening in. So this is a vast topic, let me say at the outset, and I won't be able to go into the detail that may be demanded by purists, but let me, and I'll try to keep statistics, although there'll be a few at the beginning, statistics to a minimum, since they're not easy to absorb, of course. But they're very telling. And secondly, look, for another 5 weeks, I'm still an international civil servant. So this is a very sensitive subject as well. I won't be therefore criticising any government nor passing any judgments on any governments. And I think the first thing that we have to try to do in any case is to try to understand what is happening in this world, which is an extremely difficult task, I think. But I do think the 3 words in the title of this talk really go to the heart of some of the major things that are occurring at the moment in the world. Technology, first of all, competition, and I'm using that more in the sense of rivalry, well, both economic and security, which I'll come to, and then, of course, multilateralism, about which I won't say all that much, but I think it's one of the pathways to dealing with some of the issues that we've got. So let me start with technology. Now, look, for a series of reasons, I think that technology has become the main basis of both economic and geopolitical competition. Now, perhaps that's old knowledge in a certain sense, and I think from the point of view of firms, enterprises operating, well, they've been aware of this for quite some time. There has been a huge emphasis on innovation in corporate strategies as a means of gaining competitive advantage. We see it on the geopolitical level in that technology and innovation, science, technology and innovation are really a major central element of the strategy of major economies around the world, from the United States, China, Japan, Germany, and you go on down the list. Now, what I'd like to do is to say a few words about the medium-term trends, I would say, with respect to technology, and then to move on to what I think has changed in the very recent past. And I think the change is extremely significant. And from that, see what some of the consequences of this might be. So starting with technology and some of the medium-term trends, and I'm talking, when I say medium-term, it's really the last decade or 20 years. And I think we see a number of things here. First of all, the volume of production of science and technology is quite overwhelming. And we can see that by reference to, a number of indicators, and none of these indicators is perfect, but they are very telling. So the world as a whole is spending around about 2.1% of global GDP on research and development, on the generation of new knowledge. And that's quite an exceptional amount, of course. And if you look at the leading investors in research and development, you have in 2018, the United States of America spending $581 billion, and the dollars I refer to are United States dollars throughout this, $581 billion. Now that's about 42% of the Australian GDP. It's an extraordinary sum. China in 2018 was spending $534 billion US dollars on research and development, about 37% of the Australian GDP. If you go from research and development to scientific output, science and engineering publications, and my figures are coming here from the National Science Foundation of the United States. In 2018, 2.5 million peer-reviewed science and engineering articles were published worldwide. And if you went back 10 years to 2008, it was 1.75 million only. So 1.75 to 2.5 million peer-reviewed science and engineering articles being published in the world. A Nature blog, actually published in 2014, said that the global scientific output is doubling every 9 years. So there's extraordinary volume. And then if you go to the technology side and patent applications, you see exactly the same thing. 2018, 3.3 million patent applications worldwide. 10 years earlier, it was 1.9 million applications. So I think the first point, an enormous acceleration of science and technology production. Now, the second point, I think, that we see in this short, medium term is that, as I think you're all aware, there has been a fundamental and rapid shift in the geography of this production. Really fundamental, and I think this is an extremely important point now, and it's a prelude to all that follows, I think. So again, just running through those indicators in terms of research and development. In 1960, the United States accounted for 69% of global research and development. By 2018, that had come down to 28%. So this is a huge change, of course. What happened in between? Asia, and in particular, China. You know, you also have Japan, Korea, and others. In terms of science and engineering publications, same picture. You know, you have in 2008, the United States publishing 394,000 peer-reviewed science and engineering articles, and China 249,000. 10 years later, China 528,000 peer-reviewed science and engineering articles. United States 423,000. And again, in technology, in patent applications, you see the same thing. 2018, Asia, well, 2/3 of the intellectual property applications, a little over 2/3, worldwide were filed in Asia. Not coming from Asia, but filed in Asia, a lot of them coming from Asia. China in 2019, last year, passed the United States as the leading filer of international patent applications under our Patent Cooperation Treaty. And by way, you know, a data point here is that we're told by the Chinese National Intellectual Property Administration that in the first 6 months of this year, 2020, given COVID and everything else, China's number of international patent applications is up by 20%. That's 20% on the leading figure. So you have an extraordinary shift. Now, I think that this is an extremely profound development. Everyone does, of course. But let's just look back in history a little bit. And you see that since, you know, around about the Renaissance, you could say that Europe dominated for many centuries science and technology input production. Now, we, of course, have a fairly Eurocentric view of the world, and we tend to forget China and India in that past. But nevertheless, Europe, I think, for many reasons, and of course, this is one of those areas where, you know, you require much more detail, but Europe dominated for several centuries. The United States joined and became probably the dominant source of science and technology around about the beginning of the 20th century. Japan joined the race probably in the 1970s and 80s, becoming a major player then. Korea, you know, has joined the race to some extent, but at a lower level from the 2000s, I would say. And then China has joined in a major way, as we see from all of those figures. So the result is that you have multipolar competition. It's not the world that has prevailed for the last several centuries, where you just had Europe and North America. You've got Japan, China, and Asia more generally. So this is going to influence everything, and it's a really major factor. Now, thirdly, let's leave the volume of production and the changing geography of the production of science and technology. And a third point about a trend that we're all aware of again is speed. Now, there's not many good indicators that I know of to measure the speed of change of technology, but we're all aware of it as a feature of our daily lives. But let me just illustrate it this way, and I take it from Richard Leakey, actually, his book on anthropology. You know, for humanity, it took humanity 5 million years after standing on 2 feet, you know, bipedalism, and liberating humanity's hands to do other things, 5 million years before they made the first tools. Then it took, from that point, 1.8 million years for the mastery of fire. And then from that point, 700,000 years to the Neolithic agrarian revolution, changing to settlements, basically, and the domestication of animals and plants. And then it took 12,000 years to the Industrial Revolution. And then it took about 140 years to the Digital Revolution. So I think if you see it in that light, you have this enormous compression or acceleration of technological development. And that, speed point, I think we've discussed in previous sessions, I think it has profound institutional consequences because our institutions were designed for a completely different, world and pace. And there are many questions that arise from that. Now, my last point about these general sort of short, medium-term trends in technology worldwide is that, of course, with the advent of digital technology, and in particular the internet and networking, the deployment and use of technologies is now global. Now, you might argue that's been the case for a long while, and we could have a discussion about that, but the nature of digital technology and networking and the internet is that we have global deployment. Now, that's a very significant thing, I think, in terms of this competition that we see. Now, with those general trends, let's move to two things that I want to say now about, which I think are more recent in their origin and which are shaping the nature of competition and are going to have really radical effects, or are having really radical effects for firms, enterprises, for countries, and for the nature of geopolitical competition in the world. So the first of those, and these are both much more recent, the first of those is that it's closure, basically. We are witnessing now, I think, after a fairly long period of expansion of globalization from, let's say, some would say the 1970s, some would say the 1990s, and the influence also of the new trading, international trading regime through the Uruguay round and the formation of the World Trade Organization in about 1994. So, but at any rate, we have witnessed this long period, fairly long period, several decades of expansion. That's changing. There are many signs in this world of closure. Now, what are they? And I'm not going to go into detailed statistics here, but first of all, foreign direct investment is plummeting. And this is not just COVID. This was happening pre-COVID. So foreign direct investment, and it's a very important indicator, it's plummeting. Protectionism is skyrocketing. So in particular, since the G20 meeting in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, a couple of years ago, when their usual enunciation of the value of free trade was omitted from their declaration, we have seen protectionism, the incidences of protectionism rising across the world. Now, as with many of these trends, I think it would be a misreading of the situation to ascribe this to one country only. It's happening in many countries. There may be more influential countries, there may be some leading it, there may be some who express it in a particular way which catches our attention, but it's more widespread. And I think we need to be aware of that. The third sign of closure, global value chains. They're being dismantled around the world. Now, this is in part COVID related, but it was also happening. Now, there's a recent report, if anyone's interested, published by the McKinsey Global Institute, which gives you a lot of detail of what's happening in terms of global value chains. But global value chains, look, there are a couple of reasons why they are going out of fashion. The first of those reasons is a technological phenomenon. let me give you the example of Adidas. So Adidas, like many companies, used low labor cost manufacturing centers. Okay, so their running shoe or whatever you call it, training shoes or whatever they are, running shoes were, manufactured basically in Indonesia and Vietnam, low-cost labor centers with technology from Germany. Well, now they're manufactured in Munich as a consequence of advanced manufacturing and artificial intelligence. What do you do about the labor cost? Well, you can eliminate it with technology. And that basically is one of the reasons for a change that we are seeing in global value chains. The other reason is more political in nature. So we're all familiar with this word decoupling, and the various measures that are being taken, in particular in this instance by the United States of America, to decouple, and the word can be contested, the economy, the American economy and the Chinese economy. It's not without controversy. A lot of companies are complaining about this, and it's a very hot political issue. So I'd say that's the first point of a change of scenery in this otherwise pretty robust picture of, the expansion of science and technology, is you have a lot of signs of closure in this world. Now, my second point is a very sensitive point, and that is, and it's a fairly recent thing, and that is the conjunction that we are seeing between the economy and security. Now, the first, the economy, is, of course, this conjunction of the economy and security is an agent of closure. It's one of the agents of closure in the world, and it explains a great deal about the sort of measures of closure that we are seeing. But to give you some examples of this conjunction of the economy and security, look at the review of foreign direct investment proposals. Of course, you can look at it in terms of CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment of the United States, which is managed by the Department of the Treasury. You can look at it also in terms of what Germany has done, or the United Kingdom, or France, all of which have taken measures to lower the threshold for review, for triggering a review of a foreign direct investment proposal when it concerns essentially technology, or it might be termed critical infrastructure, or it might be termed has security consequences. That's one big example. There are other examples of this conjunction, Huawei and 5G. So I needn't go into the details there. You're all familiar with this story, which is unfolding across the world. So Huawei has very sophisticated technology in terms of 5G, a major key technology being deployed around the world, and a major key technology for the future, key technology for artificial intelligence and so forth. And we see that essentially what is going on there is an interplay of economic considerations, technological considerations, and security considerations. Other examples of this conjunction: cyber attacks, cyber intrusions. So, of course, there is a military or security side to certain cyber attacks and cyber intrusions that we're seeing around the world. But it's not confined to that. Companies are targeted. And for example, in the current climate, there are allegations of cyber attacks with respect to technology for vaccine production. that has received a certain amount of publicity in the United Kingdom, and that's, I think, another example. The restrictions that are being put in place by certain countries with respect to universities, with respect to the connections universities may have, the review of student visas, the review of short-term visas, these are all part of this phenomenon of the conjunction of the economy and society, and as I said, a contribution to closure in this world. Now, there's a lot that you can say about this, and it's a very sensitive subject, and you know, I'll tread fairly carefully here. But let me say, first of all, let me just make a couple of comments on it of a more general nature. First of all, the connection between the military and technology is probably as old as technology. And you can find many salient examples of this, ranging from Leonardo da Vinci's letter to the Duke of Milan, basically a job application, saying, look, I can build you catapults, I can build you, you know, all sorts of military devices. Essentially, that was what he was selling. And you can go through, you know, many other historical examples, I won't, right down to the origin of Silicon Valley now. And inconvenient though that might be for some of the people in Silicon Valley now and the sort of government-free attitude that they might have, the military was very connected with the establishment of some of the major technologies and some of the major companies in Silicon Valley. There's no sin in this. This is not a criticism, it's an observation. The integrated circuit, the internet, networking technology more generally, the transistor and semiconductors, they all came out of military projects. And many of the major players in Silicon Valley, early Silicon Valley, Bell Laboratories, Texas Instruments, IBM, and so on. So this connection between security or military and technology, it's as old as humanity. I think what you have, however, is something that's a little bit new in the current situation. And why is there such a, you know, connection now? And here I think you've got two explanations. The first is that when you look back at the Cold War was really about military rivalry. The Soviet Union was no economic competitor of the United States of America. The United States of America was the dominant economy in the post-Second World War period. There is, you know, absolutely no doubt about that. The Soviet Union was just not a competitor. It was a military competition, essentially, military security competition with certain technological, you know, showcases like space technology and so on. But the economy wasn't there. That's changed. China is a major economy. It's a $13 trillion economy, the second largest economy in the world. It's an economic as well as a military competitor. So that's a different scene. And that's one of the reasons why we're getting this conjunction of the economy and security. I think the second reason why we're getting this conjunction of the economy and security is the nature of the technology. It's interchangeable, you know. It's one thing to be making a cannon, you know, for which you do need technology, of course, and you need metallurgy, and you need explosive technology, you need a few other things. Digital technology, it's entirely interchangeable, I would say. Now, you know, you're free to disagree. And that's what we're seeing in cyber intrusions. Some of them are military security in nature, and some of them are economic in nature. Same technology that can be used quite easily here. It's what we're seeing in respect to the race for artificial intelligence, you know, where you have a strategic race going on, not only because of the benefits of artificial intelligence in its current expressions that we see in society and the economy, but also this fear that someone is going to make the advance which will introduce a more general artificial intelligence, which is beyond the capacity, beyond the capabilities of what we now see. Now, one other comment then, if I may make here, and I'm really making these comments just to throw out suggestions here. President Eisenhower, in his farewell radio and television address to the American people in June 1961, he famously said, and you're all, I think, familiar with this, he famously said, and I quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." Now, that's coming from a former general, head of the military forces, President of the United States of America. 2 years ago in Brussels in 2018, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, made a speech, and he condemned or warned against what he called the data industrial complex. I think, and I'd be very reluctant to, disagree with such an eminent authority as Tim Cook, but I think really the correct expression is not data industrial, but military data complex or security data complex. So there we have it. Look, this is a huge issue. And I'm raising it because, we're all citizens of democracies here, and I think we need to be aware of what's going on. And we're in many respects in the early days, and we need to be able to exercise our democratic rights of a certain amount of transparency of what's happening in this world. Now, some of the consequences, and I'll be fairly brief here, I leave you to work out the consequences yourselves, really. But some of the consequences, look, I think personally, personally, I'm a strong believer in openness and collaboration. And I think they're both connected with technological success. Openness and collaboration. Well, what we're seeing is not that in the world. That, I think, is a cause for worry. And I think, look, you can mount historical arguments of the dangers of closure, really. If you see, and it's not necessarily always willed, if you see that there was a long period, and here the historians are going to be very angry with me because I'm telescoping so much, but there was a long period of globalization, a very intense wave of globalization at the end of the 19th century. It was interrupted. It was interrupted by many factors, including the First World War, the turbulent 1920s, various political movements that arose, the Great Depression, the protectionism that came with the Great Depression and the closure that we received, that we experienced. And of course, the Second World War. But that, period of history, it took a long while for us to reconstruct what we had before as a consequence of those events which may not have been willed, but which constituted closure in this world. The foreign direct investment made by the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and the Netherlands was larger in 1914 until the mid-1990s. Okay? 60 million people left Europe for the Americas, North America, but also South America, in the second half of the 19th century. The closure that occurred because of these cataclysmic events that we had in the 20th century, as well as certain discriminatory laws, especially in the 1920s, immigration in the United States didn't reach its pre-1914 levels until the 1990s. So this to say that I think we need to be very careful about closure and its impact, not just its technological impact, but its political impact. Another risk, of course, is fragmentation. You know, we have a big risk of the fragmentation of the internet, the splinternet. We know about that, and that as a major risk. Now, I personally think it would be a major failure on the part of the world and international society if we lost the value of universal connectivity. But it's a risk that's out there. Self-reliance is a posture that is now being adopted by countries. Prime Minister Modi, in his speech just 3 weeks ago, said, we now have to be self-reliant. You know? President Xi has said the same thing. So the impact of closure is having also this effect of, well, we'll turn to self-reliance, we'll do it ourselves. And then all the advantages that all of you in the business community are aware of open innovation and connections and collaboration, scientific and technologically, are at risk here with all that is going on. So I think there's real danger in this situation and that we are experiencing, and we need to be very careful. Now, I've spoken for far too long, but let me make just 2 points to conclude and hand over to all of you. You know, what can we do about this? Well, the normal response, well, for many people, at any rate, and perhaps I'm a bit biased here, would be, well, international cooperation has to provide a way out of this, provide a way in which we can deal with these really significant things that we're seeing unfold before our eyes. Well, there are 2 problems here. To cut a long story short, and I think, you know, we could talk about this, it deserves to be talked about in much greater detail. The first problem is what, you know, for want of a better term, I would call design obsolescence. The current international model for international cooperation at the multilateral level was designed in the late 1940s in a world that was technologically, politically, geopolitically, economically, socially, in every way you look at it, completely different. We're 70 years on from that, but we've got a design that was made for a completely different world. Now, I'm not going to unpack that. That, you know, really needs a lot of analysis. That's the essence of the problem. So that's one problem, that this design just doesn't work in this world. And you know, it's a long question. Excuse me. We would have to go into it in much greater detail. The second, and perhaps greater threat, is because that first problem is a lack of satisfaction with the expression, the form of multilateralism, excuse me, at the moment. The second problem is a lack of satisfaction with, or an attack upon, the whole idea of international cooperation. Doesn't matter what expression it is, it's, you know, that we've got a problem. Well, the way in which we're going to solve it is not international cooperation. We're going to solve it, you know, either nationally or in an alliance here or so on. So the very idea of international cooperation is under threat. And I'll just leave the multilateralism at that basis. It's a really, you know, massive problem we're facing. Nobody's listening to the UN. You know, let's face it. We're a specialised agency, you know. But this is something that's very significant in this world. Now, my last point is, you know, I've skirted in and out and generally avoided what about the COVID-19 pandemic and what's its effect on that. and you know, that's a huge question too, like all of these questions. But just very briefly, I would say that the main effect is that the pandemic has been an accelerator. It's accelerated pre-existing trends and intensified them. And I think that's the case whichever way you look across. It's not necessarily introducing new things. It's accelerating and intensifying things that were there in incipient form, perhaps, or otherwise. For example, the virtualization of economic activity. That's not new with COVID. It was there, but it's accelerated by the pandemic. The cashless economy. It's not new. It was happening, but it's accelerated by the pandemic. Nationalism. It's not new. It was happening, but it's finding an expression in vaccine nationalism. The dismantling of global value chains, again, not new, but accelerated because of necessity as a result. Self-reliance, you know, it's another thing that it's not exactly new, but it's being accelerated because of the health technology questions. Populism, not new, but accelerated. So I think we have an accelerator, and that's a very dangerous thing. Of course, all of this is secondary to fundamental health considerations. There, you know, we are all, I think, in praise of our health workers, our emergency workers, and all of those who are struggling to get us through this wretched pandemic. But in between time, it's an enormous accelerator for some quite worrying trends that we're experiencing. Now, I've spoken too long. I apologise for that. I hand it over to our very distinguished Jed, our moderator.
Thank you so much, Francis, for that really rich lecture. And I think for all of us in Australia, we were lapping all of that up. For someone to cross over from protectionism to look at securitization, and also if you want to look at demobilization in terms of the opposite trend in terms of movement of people, was particularly powerful, and we're spoiled to have you speaking with us tonight. On that note, I now do want to introduce our panelists for this evening to discuss those remarks. And first up, we have Sally Ann Williams, the CEO of Cicada Innovations. Sally Ann has a long and distinguished history, probably known to many of you. She's worked in Google, worked very much at the coalface of deep tech, and worked in various government advisory roles as well. We also have Dr. Ian Oppermann, who of course I know fairly well. Ian is the New South Wales government's chief data scientist. He's also worked in Europe and in Australia, including at CSIRO in senior leadership roles. We have Dr. Jenny Gordon, who's the chief economist from DFAT, who we're delighted can join us this evening. Jenny recently assumed that role in late 2019, previously with Nous Group and the Productivity Commission. So we're really spoiled with the people we have on the panel tonight to discuss Francis's remarks. And Francis, I might actually take the talking stick there and direct the first question to the panel, who I all think were very interested in the topics you're talking about, given their expertise and experience. But you mentioned some of the challenges and the design obsolescence, if you will, of the institutions we have in the world, and it's including, not unfair to say, the institution you work in as well, and the UN system as a whole. And I wanted to go to the question you raised, the race around critical and emerging technologies, including AI. And I might ask you then, in terms of those technologies, what do you think are the prospects for global agreements around the governance of those technologies? So we already have the OECD principles on AI reaffirmed at the G20 ministerial meeting last year. But I might ask you what you think are the prospects for global governance and agreement in light of what you termed quite a fractured global world and system. Yeah. And then I'll go to the panel as well.
You want me first, Jed, or we go to the panel?
I think we can go to the panel first. Whoever wants to dive in off the rank, and then we'll get you to return to that. Thank you, Francis.
Jenny's reaching for the unmute button.
Was Ian.
Well, Jenny, if you'd like to go first, I saw you reach for the unmute button first.
Okay, thank you. I have to thank Francis. That was an absolute tour de force of all the things that keep way too many of us awake at night, I think, worrying about those kinds of things. But we actually have to take a positive look at this. And I think this is actually the moment where the middle powers around the world need to get together and actually really work towards addressing some of these. We've kind of freeloaded, if you like. We had the Bretton Woods institutions. We had you know, the system set up. We had US leadership in you know, so many of ways, which was, even though, you know, obviously it had its own agendas, it did promote open global trading systems and allowed us to, you know, as an economist, make those great gains to trade. And I think the trend is really quite worrying. And I think some of the trends come about because markets, a bit like technology, don't come with any value set. You know, digital doesn't have a value set. Digital doesn't care, you know, who you are, what you are, you know, whether you're rich or poor. It's going to just work, you know, as digital does. Markets are the same way. So markets don't have an equilibrating mechanism where we look after the least well off. We expect governments to do that for us, or social systems. So I think the challenge is to us sort of middle level powers is to reinvent the institutions. And I think we've got to work with what we've got. I think, you know, we're not going to start again from scratch, because to start again from scratch is going to require the sort of thing that, you know, World War II was the you know, starting the institutions again from scratch. And I don't think we want to go there. So I'd rather see us work with the institutions we have. And I think there is a real opportunity, because so many countries do recognise that we do need systems, and you know, and we need to work with what we've got to try and put systems in place, because I think many of the risks that you really highlighted are things that we need to work against. So that's my opening salvo. Over.
If I can pick up on that brilliant opening salvo, I think I'm going to make a plug for standards. And whilst the point about data doesn't have ethics, data doesn't necessarily, there's a really valuable point about developing consistent ways of thinking about what the algorithm does, issues related to the appropriateness of data and data quality, which can help ensure that the tools that we build operate the way we expect, just as you expect a safety standard for building material or for an automobile. There are ways of actually ensuring that the tool is behaving the way we expect, and that's a really great thing for standards. And I think one of the other things about Australia being not just a middle power, it's also considered to be honest. So in the conversations which are really quite heated at the moment around developing standards for artificial intelligence, Australia is always seen as playing a straight back, trying to do the right thing, and trying to deliver the right sort of standards. And I think those are really powerful ways of thinking about. Someone once said to me that my job as a data scientist is to put guns in people's hands, but I prefer to think of it about building increasingly sharp knives. And you want to make sure that you put the sharpest knife in the hand of the person who knows what they're doing, understands why they're doing it, and has an accountability framework around that explains what they should do and when they should do it. The reality is, of course, that all tech can be used for all sorts of reasons. If we can formalise the bit in the middle, we can at least understand what the potential is and avoid adverse, unexpected, unintended adverse outcomes. But the bigger issue, of course, is why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we using the data that we're using? Why do we select the data that we select? And what do we do with that data and the insight? Getting agreement on that bigger outcomes framework, or the framework as to the why or the so what, is something which is going to be culturally based, is going to be something which makes sense in a cultural context, and it's going to be something which aligns to social norms. But there's an opportunity for us to do that work between the bits and the principles, but ultimately the principles are going to be the things that are really defined by the cultures that we operate within.
I might jump in here and maybe be a little bit, I don't know whether it'll be controversial or not, but I've observed from the front line, so to speak, of where I spent the last 13 years, and certainly where I am right now at Cicada Innovations. I do think standards are great. I think looking at regulation and coming up with those things is great. However, regulation doesn't solve for the fact that we don't have diverse people and diverse representation in our science and engineering community who are building these products and services. And I'll give you a very concrete example of this. Globally, we regulated wearing of seatbelts. We regulated it a very long time ago, but we did not change the protocols for what we used as crash test dummies to include females and include children until about 20 years later. So we have a fundamental problem, and we're seeing this more and more in science and engineering. We have a fundamental problem of representation of who are making these decisions and who is having the conversations that isn't culturally sensitive and isn't culturally appropriate and isn't culturally diverse. And so I think what we need to do in all of these things, and I do agree that we need to actually look at standards and we need to look at these things, but if we don't fundamentally fix who has a seat at the table, and this isn't just about gender, this is about cultural backgrounds, this is about cultural perspectives and understanding, it's about language, it's about socioeconomic status. If we don't fundamentally change that, all we're going to do is replicate the same thing again and again and again. And we've seen this in science. There's numerous science and engineering scientific studies that are out there now that show differences in how women are treated when they present in hospitals in both the UK and in the US and present with symptoms that mimic, that look like a heart attack and they're sent home versus men. So the unconscious bias that we have in society, we have to acknowledge is it exists. We absolutely all have it. And the only way to mitigate against that is have more diverse voices and around in the representation in positions of power and decision making. And that goes both to designing and building the technology and the artificial intelligence and really understanding it, but also the perspectives of use. There's a really interesting case that we see in Australia right now when we think about cultural appropriation and cultural sensitivity. And it's not just with our First Nations people, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I think it extends more broadly to First Nations globally, where we look at the values between we versus me. And what I mean by that is that when we look to, Western democracies, there's this value of me and my rights. Whereas you look at a lot of other First Nations, it's a value of we and what are our collective rights versus my rights. And so some of these things need to be unpicked. And my greatest fear is that we actually have people building artificial intelligence solutions in all kinds of areas, particularly in health, particularly in finance, and they are not representative of the populations that they're meant to serve. And we just don't have the great awareness of people when we're looking at that from a policy perspective and from a lens. We're not training our computer scientists in ethics in universities. We're not having these discussions. These are things that we really need to kind of actually raise and at the coalface actually build that into our fundamentally into our design process of how we allow and how we think about building for the future. So just from a technologist standpoint of view and somebody who's been there, I think that's one of the biggest challenges is even when we're well intentioned, we're going to miss it just because there's people that look the same around the table so much of the time.
Sally, I might actually pick up that point because I know we're going to return to Francis in a second, and I think it's clear that his discussion has kicked off this really rich dialogue and all these important aspects. But I just wonder, in terms of Jenny's point about us leaning in with middle powers, for want of a better word, whether we might be able to channel some of the aspirations you talk to through those lenses. Because I also am acutely aware that if you talk about collective versus individual approaches, it's also a model that's politically co-opted by countries that actually have no respect for human rights or very little, as an argument for alternative internets, for alternative ways of working. And I wonder if I can draw your thoughts on how we channel very, very important points you've raised about preventing it from being one group or two groups in society channeling our digital future, how we might actually use the institutions we have, through our relevant Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in this case, but also forums like Standards and the ITU to actually channel those voices. So I might ask that question of you as well, like where do you see the clear opportunities for us to drive that agenda internationally so that we can perhaps, to your analogy, build the rules of the road in a more responsive way?
I mean, it's a really challenging one. I actually want to see more new institutions arise. I think our existing institutions, you know, you know, I do agree with Jenny, we've got to use what we've got, but they're certainly not perfect, and those flaws are becoming more inherent day by day. But one of the things we have seen is that, you know, technology has given people who are powerless or who have not had a voice a greater ability to have a voice moving forward. So I think there's an opportunity to actually bring more people around the table and actually create new forums and new ways of having these dialogues and surfacing those conversations to the top. Now, the challenge is also fake news and everything else. But I think, you know, if we can actually have a diversity of conversation and a richer conversation, we're going to wrestle and get better outcomes at the end of the day. And so I think there's opportunity for more citizen science. We've got citizen science happening. We're seeing it in COVID right now. There's a lot of breakthroughs in the actual technology that's being built by people who are practitioners. They're out there in fields and labs. They're not necessarily in our research institutes. There is a role and a voice to play with them. We have to be careful about moderating that, and we have to, you know, have some safety and some ethical conversations around it. But there's a real opportunity to bring more people to the table. And I think do that in smarter ways and deliberately go, who is missing from the conversation, and what and way can we enable their voices to be brought in and to be heard. We can disagree with them, but, you know, to at least give them that opportunity to have a seat at the table.
Jenny, I might draw your comments on that as well, just noting your role. I think that was the opening remarks you made, but using our existing channels in a much better manner, I think, to put it bluntly, and if you wouldn't mind commenting on that.
Yeah, no, certainly. I don't know if you're aware, we've recently, DFAT's put out an international cyber engagement strategy. It's really a framework for engagement rather than, you know, sort of setting out a roadmap for exactly how we're going to go about doing it. And I think, you know, really it's got kind of three major aims, I suppose you could say. So one is really getting cooperation on the rules, and that's getting to standards, the sorts of things that Ian talks about. But really seeing that, you know, how do you maintain connectivity and build connectivity? And I agree entirely with Sally-Ann that we lack diversity. I mean, we just think about the data sets we train algorithms on, and, you know, the data sets are biased, so the algorithms are going to be biased, and what are we going to do about it? And, you know, that issue has been around. So ethics is not just around, does your robot choose to kill, you know, the two people, the woman with the baby carriage or the important driver of the car? You know, ethics is actually around a much richer set of issues that we have to deal with. So, but the rules are the thing that allow you to have exchange of data. I mean, the certification of products means that, you know, if you want to sell a product, you've got to be able to sell, you know, transfer data to go with that product. If you can't transfer the data because the rules don't let you, or the interoperability doesn't let you, then you've got serious problems. So the part of our discussion about, it's a new term and I think it's horrible, but it's called tech diplomacy. You know, how do you have discussions with the countries and agencies around the world about making sure that the rules allow, you know, trade to happen, allow goods and services, allow data to flow. So that's one big area. Clearly, there's cooperation around preventing cybercrime, and that's where you move into that kind of nexus between the security and the economics. And you know, it's interesting that we're starting to have, you know, discussions around geoeconomics, and the economists and the security people are starting to realize they need to talk to each other. Partly because economics can be weaponized, but also because if you want to actually solve security problems, having strong economic links and economic costs to not actually cooperating is a really good way about trying to improve outcomes. So there's the whole cybersecurity. You know, there's the sort of the country side of it, I guess, caring about our looking after our national security, but it's also all the sort of the dark web and all the non-state actors who are pretty active as well, that we need to protect all of us against. And then there's actually a really interesting dimension to this strategy on protecting human rights and promoting human rights. And I think this is where Sally-Ann's point about how we actually, you know, see the internet as an instrument to promote human rights rather than to erode them, to promote voices rather than to shut them down, And I think that needs a lot of careful consideration. So I would say we're at the beginning of the conversation and the journeys rather than having found our way forward. I think you've got to start somewhere. But that's sort of where I would see a big push. And then the other big area is what we've already been doing for a long time in our free trade agreement agenda, and how to try and encourage countries that are working together through these sort of network of free trade agreements. And I can never remember the full title of this. We used to call it the CTPPI, and then it dropped the US and became, I think it's the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There you go, it's a mouthful. But that agreement has probably some of the most advanced agreements in terms of digital technology, e-commerce and the like. So it's again, it's not everything, but it's a starting point, and it's a good platform to keep progressing in terms of agreements.
Thank you for that. Francis, I might go back to you on that point. And I mean, I think you can sense there in the comments the eagerness to lean in and to make sure that the development we have is inclusive as well. And I'll leave you on that note to issue some reflection.
Basic agreement with everything everyone has said, and I quite agree on this bias point. I mean, it's fantastic that Sally Ann raises. It's fantastically important thing, and most of the times we're unaware. And standards, I agree with Ian. You know, this is fundamental too. Just look at the mobile telephone. You know, everyone expects it to work wherever they get off. It can only happen with international cooperation and standards. But let me just say a couple of things about Jenny's. Well, I'm delighted, you know, with this middle power initiative, because, you know, we're facing a world in which, well, let's go back to the old adage, you know, of African diplomacy, where they say, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets hurt. We're all familiar with that. You know, I heard a variation of it recently, which was, it's the grass that gets hurt, whether the elephants are fighting or making love. So in this world where there is a huge scale difference, you know, some of the figures I gave with respect to investments in research and development and so on. Look at investments in AI. Roughly 20 billion each from China and the United States, 2 billion from Europe. You know, the scale is another important point about technology. So I'm delighted that middle powers will say, we are going to be suffering, in inverted commas, the consequences of tension between the major powers. And how can we ameliorate this situation? And I think this is exceptionally important point. And I also agree with Jenny that, well, we have to work with what we've got, but we are all very conscious of the failings of the current international organizations. Here, look, it's not just failings of secretariats. If you look at the habits of member states in the alliances, the issues they raise, it's a 1970s agenda that many of them are on. So you have a big difference here. Some people are talking about a world that doesn't exist anymore. It may exist for them. So that's another problem with trying to get international cooperation. And my last point I'd say is that, you know, in the 19th century, there were 4 international organizations that were formed. And in chronological order and using their current names, because they've all changed, it was first the International Telecommunications Union, ITU, was the telegraph. Second, it was the World Meteorological Organization. And third, it was Universal Postal Union. And fourth, it was WIPO, actually. Now, those 4 agencies all still exist and arguably do more or less a good job. more or less, you can always criticise and so on. It's a testimony to the value of international technical cooperation. Because in between time, we had the League of Nations that was born and died. We have the United Nations that was born and is suffering. So I think we're much better at technical cooperation. So this is where the standards and all these points and the middle powers have a great role to play.
Thank you so much. As I hit the unmute button on our classic COVID scenario. But look, thank you for those reflections, Francis, as well. I was actually going to draw you on those related questions too. So Ian spoke about the technical role we can play, and I suppose it gets to a point Jenny made about using institutions for our own advantage. And Ian, I might ask you to talk a little bit, because I didn't come back to you in the last session, about where you see some of the information sharing and collaboration going on now across boundaries or across what are geopolitical fault lines. And if you can talk a bit about that, because I know data sharing is something you've worked on heavily. I might ask you to talk a bit about that and how you are actually building international agreement around some of those norms. And then I want to come back to some of that deeper stuff, including the what Sally kicked off a really important discussion on, to talk about how Australia can use that for our competitive advantage.
So, Jed, you said data sharing, they're magic words for me, and you've got my immediate attention. So, a big part of my job for the last 5 years has been linking data sets together, people-centric data sets together, to understand wicked policy challenges, complex, subtle, ultimately has people's behaviour at the heart, domestic and family violence, children at risk of significant harm, and then things which are a little bit more mundane but still important, smart cities, where to put the next rail line. The challenge always is when you link people-centered data together, at what point does it become de-identified, potentially personally identifiable information? So I went to an international standards meeting a couple of years ago and said, give me the standard that tells me when I've got personally identifiable information, when I've linked enough data sets together. The working assumption is link enough, you get personally identifiable. And this was an AOB item at the end of a 5-day meeting, and the debate raged for several hours about, actually, is it an issue? Is someone working on it? And can we tell? And in all of the conversations we have around privacy, and typically government is more of a concern about using the identified data than Facebook and some of the other platforms. It's a very, very substantial question which needs to be addressed. And so the response was to create an advisory group, which 2 years later has just been announced as a working group. Australia has led or jointly led the activity to date over the last 2 years, trying to identify aspects associated with data sharing and use. And some of the aspects of the conversation have been really interesting. Over the course of the last 2 years, there have been some very large companies that have shown a great deal of interest in this work, trying to steer it in a certain direction. There have been some very substantial nations who've also shown interest in this work and tried to steer it in particular directions. So the geopolitical and the company political aspects of this work became abundantly apparent. And what saved us was the joint convenership of middle power, Australia. Australia seen as an honest broker. And when we're facing off against, take this as an example, the US versus China, where all of the geopolitical tensions exist, the fact that Australia was constantly playing a straight bat meant that we could make progress. So where we sit at the moment, in particular with this data sharing work, is that we realise it intersects with everything, and I really mean everything about the 21st century and about the world we imagine for 2030 and the world we imagine for 2040 when we think about UN sustainability goals and so on. It intersects with everything about the Gs, 4G, 5G, 6G, to pick up on the ITU analogy. It intersects with every government service, every digital service, and everything we think the future will look like. It's turned out to be a much, much bigger issue than I ever imagined walking into that standards meeting. And the fact that a middle power, considered to be an honest broker, has now actually taken leadership of that activity, I think is a testament to the fact that we are the grass. And in some cases, I'm now trying to link into that analogy, there are some elephants doing whatever it is they're doing on the grass, but the grass is standing up and saying, we will keep, I'm mixing my metaphors, we'll keep playing the level field, we'll keep playing the straight bat, and we are going to make progress because ultimately it's important. The elephants will eventually move on, die, reproduce, do whatever elephants do, change shape. But grass has been around for a very long time. And I think the opportunity for us is to keep thinking about the longer term opportunity to create value and create global markets through standards and through other forms. And I think Australia is doing very well in that regard, in particular in the space of data. Sorry to mix so many metaphors with that.
Thank you, Ian. And I mean, I think you spoke about the power of a middle power there in terms of negotiation and that work that Australia has traditionally played a strong role in globally, a very delicate role, but a powerful one in achieving outcomes and some sort of sense of equilibrium. But I might also then draw the panel. I know we've had a few questions, and please keep them coming on the chat function, around the role of corporate actors. And you touched on it, Ian, very briefly, talking about countries themselves, state parties, as well as those corporate actors. And I might pick up that point is how do you all think we harness that power for good? Because I certainly acknowledge you can see corporate actors acting in different interests at different points in time. And we don't need to cite examples. I think we're all aware of where things like live streaming might not be fantastic, where law and order are issues, where human rights come into play all the time. But I might draw the panel on that question, which is how do we find that equilibrium between our broader geopolitical interests and the role of companies in the global system as well? Sally, I might go to you to begin that discussion and then return to Jenny and co.
Yeah, so I love this conversation because I think there's two parts to it, right? There's actually the role of the corporate actor and you know, both they're good and they're bad. You know, everyone has a good and a bad side. You know, we can be a gentle elephant or we can be crushing and stomping on the grass. We're all going to talk about elephants and grass all night, I think now. But corporates can and do make decisions, I think, when they realise that technology can be used in ways that is harmful, right? I think we've seen some really great examples of people speaking out and leading the way in the conversation about ethical AI. And we've seen that from our big tech companies. The other thing I think, though, that's really interesting to sort of note, and this actually speaks more to sort of some of Jenny's comments earlier, is actually the employees within those companies, right? So corporates are not faceless individuals or just a uniform thing. They are made up of very smart people, particularly big tech companies, who are able to take their services and their employment and move it somewhere else readily. And so they're able to have a share of voice in a way, in an active way, to shape and push and hold their employer accountable in a way that we haven't seen quite this swift and quick. So I think we've seen it previously with unions and things like that around pay and working conditions. Now it's actually, no, we're not actually okay with you having that particular technology and launching it in certain, you know, countries, or we're not okay with you actually using this technology and selling it to the military, or we're not okay with some of the decisions that you're making about AI in this company, and we're going to actually walk out. And we've seen examples of this. I mean, I've participated in the examples of this, and I think that's actually really, really healthy to have those discussions and to have employees that are so convicted about the mission and the opportunity that they're able to speak up and they're protected enough and they're in a place of, let's be really clear, they're in a place of privilege to be able to speak up and speak out and address some of these issues. So I think, you know, if we can engage corporates, but if we can also engage the individuals and recognise those individuals there that are willing to lead, there's some really good examples of the open source community doing that, WC3, web standards. I mean, if you've ever been to a web standards committee, they seem to go for days to get something done, and more power to them. There's a lot of negotiation on it, but it's those committed individuals in there that actually push, and sometimes they're pushing not just their company's agenda, but sometimes they're going back into their company and pushing the agenda back upwards and up the corporate chain. So it is almost like they're their own nation state. I hesitate to say that, but in some ways they have enough power, both politically and economically and social capacity and influence to kind of act in that way. And I think we have to recognize that and acknowledge it and bring it in and harness it in a way to help us lead and understand what the opportunities are and come into alignment. So it's an interesting one. It's complex.
Jenny, I might go to you, and noting your comments before on tech diplomacy, and I was going to say, I think we've all been following the work of the cyber ambassador, Dr. Tobias Feakin, as well, and so I think we're all waiting for that strategy to be launched, because it'll be certainly a bit of a game changer. But on that note, I'll go to you, because I think it's a nice segue from Sally Ann's comments.
Yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for Ian, because I was very much involved in the Productivity Commission's data sharing and use, data access and use inquiry, and have been a bit of a data champion on the, in the Productivity Commission and the like for some time now. So, and also the and with my time at NOUS, we were looking at the work that New South Wales government was doing, pulling together, particularly on vulnerable populations, and whether we could work out better ways of approaching, public services to put a wraparound services on them. So fascinating work, and really, really brilliant, and great to hear it's still going. I wanted to talk a bit about corporates and how DFAT is also, one of the things we try and do is listen to business, obviously, but one of the challenges is always that you're listening to the businesses who've currently got voice, and you're not listening to the businesses who don't have voice. And one of your challenges is that the businesses who have voice, whether they're, talking to the industry department or the like, are pushing their particular agenda. And back in my days at the Productivity Commission, you sort of saw this in the range of work that we did, where, they had their point of view, and we were trying to move beyond what was good for their business to what was good for Australian business more generally. And that's always going to be a challenge. And so we think about balancing things up. We're always thinking about carrots and sticks, and so if you think about your corporates on the data, the carrot is that they can access other data, and that allows them to add value to it. But then the stick might be to force them to share their data, so the consumer data right is a big part of that, sort of actually forcing. So the question is, this is domestically, how do we bring this in internationally, and what are the forums in which we can engage with, where we can start bringing these in? And these are some of the things that, the trade agreements are really trying to get to. So I just lost my screen. One technology. The other thing is also in terms of interoperability. So interoperability is a carrot for them. So where's the stick to force them? It's interoperability where they can use other systems, and obviously IP and licensing comes into that in a big way. But the open source is a great stick, because if they try and lock it too much, people find an open source solution. So Linux kind of kept Microsoft and others a bit more honest, because they offered a great competition. So I just think we need to be looking for ways, and again, coming back to just the trade agreements. And so some of the focus so far has been around certainty around when and how businesses can transfer data has been a really important focus in the trade agreements. Giving flexibility for businesses to store data where they want, so pushing back on data localization rules has been a big area of focus. Trying to make sure that electronic transactions aren't taxed in ways that are particularly biased. Obviously, there's some big work we need to do to stop big corporates just moving profits around the world to the least taxing location, and actually, we need, that again needs international cooperation to resolve. And then the whole issue around privacy protections. And I think the privacy protection one is probably one of the most challenging ones, because you've got the Europeans with their set of rules, US with a much, sort of more, less concerned about privacy protections, and then China with its own unique approach. And if you think about privacy protections, you could end up only being able to share data within certain bubbles. And I find that quite alarming, that kind of 3-bubble possibility. And then which bubble do we choose to belong to? And can you belong to one bubble for one thing and a different bubble for something else? And I'm not sure whether that would work or not. So there's lots of just interesting challenges, I think, that we don't yet have the answers to, but we're working on.
Thank you, Jenny. And I think you touched on that multipolarity that Francis outlined from the beginning. And Francis, I might return to you on that question. You know, the figure of the corporate actor in the international system, I'm very keen to draw you on that, because you spoke about the ways in which they intervene. You talked about patents and you cited the data on those and how that's shifting regionally, globally. But I might also draw you on that broader question I think Sally and Jenny just touched on, around the figure of the corporate actor and whether you think that's actually a help or hindrance, and noting the nuance there. So I'm drawing on, you know, the very clear understanding that some countries, their major companies are much closer to government, and you named some of them from the outset. But I might draw you on that point, and whether you think they play a constructive role in driving changes in norms, and they could be allies, or whether you think there's a lot we have to unpack before we get to that aspirational plateau.
Look, I think it's a design question, and it's one of the examples of the design obsolescence of the system that was invented at the end of the 1940s. And we have to find ways. Now, to give him his credit, I think Klaus Schwab promoted the idea of multi-stakeholder engagement. And that is, I think, exceptionally important. It's exceptionally important for a whole lot of reasons, including, you know, all that's been mentioned by the panelists, but including the fact that the expertise and the knowledge and the experience with the use of technologies resides principally in the enterprise sector. So we need to be able to harness that in the process. I would see it more or less as a sort of, you know, the traditional model in which we've all operated is states come to meet together and then they go home and they consult their interested parties. And then they form their view about what the corporations in their society, amongst others, may think, and they come back and it's an input. I think that input has to be much stronger. Because you have, for example, now, as you're all aware, Apple passed $2 trillion as capitalization in the course of the last week. $2 trillion. I mean, that's a huge amount, market capitalization of $2 trillion. So these are huge players, but in this spectrum in which you increase the involvement in the process of learning about a question, understanding it, and then starting a discussion about what sort of solutions there will be, at some stage, of course, you have to cut them off. Because that's why we invented governments, to eliminate conflict of interest, to have a government that's there that is not an interested party, much in all as the conjunction of security and economy is blurring that issue. But I do think it's an extremely important feature in the new design that must arise if we're going to have successful multilateral institutions.
Thank you for that, Francis. And of course, it's always risky suggesting a new design or a new build, because, you know, I might ask you for some of those blueprints, which I'll get to in a second. But I did want to emphasize to everyone on the call, please do send your questions through. We are very keen to tackle those, and I've got the chat function open. I know WebEx is always a treat in terms of the chat function, but do click on the chat icon and send through your thoughts, because we'd love to tackle some of the big questions you've already posed to us in terms of corporate power as well. And I think that institutional design is a good place to talk about what the future might look like, because Sally, you raised that, and you know, having institutions that are more responsive and responsible in all of these forums, whether it's in a corporate world alone, trying to navigate the nexus of norm making and the like. But what were your thoughts in terms of how we can make our institutions, I suppose, more responsive? And I actually want to get deeper than that, because I know you have a background in deep tech, and talk about design and how you think that actually would play out in a practical sense. So I'm talking about building norms and institutions from the ground up. So if we are talking about new structures, I'm really keen to know what they need to respond to.
Oh, okay, we've got another 4 hours, right? Because I know I'm not the only one that's going to have thoughts on this. Look, fundamentally, I think if we take it back to first principles, there's two things that we need to take everybody on a journey of understanding. One is to be a systems thinker and understand the interconnectedness of everything and to stop thinking in silos. So the more people that we can get on board with systemic theory and theories of systemic change and the opportunity, the better. And that is everybody. I mean, teachers, politicians, everyone. The other thing I would say, which is something that we need to actually break down in silos, and if we talk about systems and we talk about institutions that don't serve us very well anymore, I'm a product of the state school education system. I'm the first in my family to finish high school, first to go to university. Incredibly grateful from that education system. However, that education system has not changed in a very long time. And one of the disadvantages is that we teach in silos. We are in our K-12 education moving to a much more integrated system and trying to bring things together. But when we get to university, I think one of the greatest challenges is we say to people, at least in Australia in particular, we say to people, please pick your degree at the age of 16, 17 for me of what you're going to do for the rest of your life. And, that's wonderful to go deep in one area, but it actually means that you're very, very shallow and you don't understand necessarily the interconnectedness of everything else. And that's what a system is, it's interconnected. And so I think one of the things we need to really do when we're building a system, when we're building a company, when we're building the deep tech companies that are sitting behind me, there's 42 companies in here right now, everything from health and med tech, agriculture, food, environment, batteries, energy. We've got people doing modern slavery in the supply chain for food, which is both hardware and software. We've got AI, we've got, you name it, it's in here and it's at the bleeding edge and it is science and engineering innovation. And one of the things I spend the most amount of time with my founders on is putting mentors next to them that are completely different from them and from completely different disciplines. And it's actually at that nexus, it's that intersection of things where the opportunities lie. And that's where you get the greatest learning. And I think it's where you get the greatest springboard for solutions to some of the biggest problems that we're facing. But you also automatically get diversity of thought, diversity of experience, and diversity of design. So my biggest plea of if we're going to build these things, we actually need to build in our education system, starting at a very young age, this idea that we need to actually have people learn across the whole spectrum. I'm just going to say it because I don't work for government. I'm absolutely gravely concerned in Australia that we're prioritising education and we're deprioritising the arts right now, because an arts background and philosophy and ethics matters deeply to science and to engineering. And actually what we need to do is bring those two worlds closer together. And historically, I think Francis brought up Da Vinci, artist and engineer, artist and scientist. The arts and the science were much closer together. And I think we need to bring those things closer together because it's that kind of thinking and that diversity of thought that's going to be, really important.
That's fantastic. And Sally, I might also pick up on a point you raised about education. So I spent a bit of time recently travelling to Germany, including with the former Prime Minister, looking at their education models. And some of that is that they have a very, very embedded system of education where companies as well spend significant amounts, to Francis' point, not just on R&D, but actually on educational approaches where they embed students and they're not even bonded. And for an Australian, that's mind-blowing, the idea that your biggest companies would employ these really young, talented graduates. And to your point as well, they're both men and young women. It's a very mixed group, completely different backgrounds. I wondered there what more you think we can do domestically, because we've been talking a lot tonight about our international position, but I wonder, when I go through a shopping list of what we're doing domestically, I wonder how that aligns with our wonderful international position.
There's a really great report that I was involved with our chief scientists a number of years ago when I was at Google that put out, which is around this. It was the COAG STEM Partnership Forum, and we looked at the best practices around Australia of how to do this. And there's some really fantastic examples in it. One of the best examples is actually up in the Hunter region, which one of our teachers up there, Scott Sleep, ran in the education department. He was actually at Regional Development Australia, I think, when he set this program up. But he actually connected industry, local industry, with the TAFE and the vet sector and the universities to actually go into high schools and look systemically at the maths and science curriculum and how it was being taught and opportunities and exposure. And within 2 years of setting up the program, he actually increased the number of people studying advanced maths and engineering and going through to vet, both vet and university education, beyond the state average. They went below the state average to above the state average. And the female participation rates in that too went through the roof. And it's about the real world exposure, and the win is actually on both sides, right? It's the win for business up there was they knew if they didn't invest and start doing this, they would never have anybody stay, and they couldn't actually attract people there with the skill set. So they said, we'll take a long-term view and we'll grow them from the ground up. So part of it is a long-term view, but part of it is actually having those visionary people who are there and actually able to make those connections. And again, it's a system, right? Connect the parts of the system and see how by coming together, everybody actually wins, and you actually design the solution together. There's some really effective mechanisms to be able to do that, and to actually, I think, you know, for both Australia, but also more importantly globally, to learn from doing that at a local level and making it relevant to the population that you're in, and the opportunities in front of them. So there's lots of
Thank you
there.
Thank you for that. Real food for thought. And Ian, I might go to you, because you're also someone who does a lot of that work, including within government, and the talent pipeline is obviously front and centre for you. So I might ask you to pick up on that thought about what those different models would mean to the way you work. And then I want to get to some really juicy questions which have come through as well.
I thought, I actually was just Googling Finland just as we were talking, and I thought I might just very quickly reflect on my time living in Finland when Nokia was really going through the roof. We had no problem getting female engineers. We had no problem getting people in STEM graduates. We had no problem doing a whole range of things which Australia really seems to struggle with. At the same time, the government knew more about me and my data than most Australians would be comfortable with. My income was public information, how much tax I paid was public information. And it was a very, very different way of building a society. Everybody had a say, everybody got to contribute to where they were going. And Finland lives with some pretty interesting neighbours and has a pretty interesting geopolitical position in the world. And it's always surprised me after leaving Finland, coming back to Australia, that some of the challenges we have around STEM, around women in STEM, about the STEM pipeline, really seem to be cultural more than anything else. There's absolutely, Finland has the population of Sydney, and they have punched above their weight in so many different ways, in so many different times, and occasionally fallen asleep at the wheel, as we saw with the collapse of Nokia. But I think taking a long-term perspective is really the most important point. In the town that I was in Oulu, there were 5,000 R&D engineers situated 165 kilometres south of the Arctic Circle. Despite the fact that may seem nowheresville, there were 5,000 R&D engineers working on what was 3G, and then 4G, and then 5G. So taking a long-term perspective, backing yourself, and really truly believing in the art of the possible, identifying as many of those ridiculous devices up front as you can, and building towards that future outcome is really quite a remarkable difference to a country like Finland compared to a federated system like Australia. We are culturally different. That's it's absolutely true. It's unavoidable. But taking a long-term perspective and really doing the things that help build towards the outcomes over the long term, I think is absolutely the right way to think.
Thank you for that, Ian. I might change tack just in light of the questions we've had, and thank you so much for those of you who are typing away. We are watching and listening. And I might take this question straight to Francis and then return to the panel for their reflections. Because, of course, whilst we've been talking about elephants, as someone pointed out, there is another elephant in the room. And I think we all read the news media, and so we know exactly what that's going to be. But there's a lot of talk at the moment around tech transfer, and in particular forced tech transfer, issues around dual-use technology. So for those of you on the call, and Francis alluded to this, but forms of civilian technology that can be used in military and other settings, which might be inimical to our economic and military interests and social interests as a result. And we did have a very good question around how do we play on an equal plane globally in systems when some of the advances countries make might be based on forms of intellectual property theft? That is a question in the public realm, certainly spoken about very extensively. I don't want to be too granular, but there's a lot of commonalities and functionalities between WeChat and WhatsApp and various other applications. And I might ask Francis if you wanted to comment on that. So we're talking about open borders and free trade with those aspirational goals in mind that Jenny alluded to, the underpinnings of our economic system as an outward-looking nation. But what are the challenges where we approach the table, perhaps with different starting points, for want of a better word?
Yeah, thanks, Jed, and thanks. I think it was Richard Baldwin, if I remember correctly, that from the question that came up. Look, this is obviously, the heart of the matter that we're seeing. So, and it's something that I can't comment on too much for two reasons. First, because of my position, we don't have, as an organisation, tools to deal with infringement of intellectual property rights. The member states have never given the Secretariat that power. They prefer to deal with that on a bilateral basis, right? Or there is a dispute resolution mechanism in the World Trade Organization, although it's not functioning at the moment for other reasons. So I'm a bit limited. And then I think the second reason why I'm limited is because I don't think there's too much transparency here. Frankly speaking, when you try to separate out the layers of what is propaganda and what is absolute truth, it's a very difficult question, and we're not getting full transparency on these questions. And a lot is happening in the cyber world and in terms of cyber attacks. And who's doing what. But that all said, I think if you take an historical perspective on this, you'll find that at the time of the Industrial Revolution, there's a town in Belgium which has a statue erected to a person who brought back, a cotton gin from the United Kingdom, stole it. It was a capital offence at the time. So there's a lot of instances of, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, of, first of all, other European countries stealing technology from the United Kingdom, and then the United States stealing technology from the United Kingdom. It's all documented. This is not controversial in my view. So this is not a new phenomenon. We have seen this throughout history, I think. Now, of course, what might be new is the scale that we're seeing. So if you are listening to some of the estimates that are coming out of the United States of America, you're talking about trillions of dollars. But again, I'd like to see some transparency about this issue so that we can understand better what's really happening in this world. A lot of everyone's got their anecdotes. A lot of people will tell you, yes, well, this happened to me, that happened to me, and they stole this and they stole that, and so on. It's, of course, the big question out there is this dividing line between permitted imitation and illegitimate, theft. And it's not an easy question. If you think of fashion, well, you couldn't have a fashion unless there's some communality about it. So there is a certain amount of legitimate copying that's going on. You couldn't have a school of art unless they were, why are these the Impressionists? Because of certain communality in their style, which is accepted. Now, but at a certain point, and how do we teach our children? Do it this way. We teach them through imitation. But at a certain point, we say, no, but now you can't do this. So, as you rightly point out, Jed, there is a cultural dimension to this, which is, one of the things that we're all trying to do is to get a common understanding of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So, it's the heart of the matter. We're hearing, of course, a number of complaints coming out of the United States of America. not alone. We're hearing transfer of technology, forced transfer of technology is one of those. We're hearing the response from China, and we're trying to juggle these and take a position on. Not we, I mean the world.
The world. Thank you, Francis. I know, perplexing and difficult questions too. Who on the panel wants to go first in tackling that? Just noting it was a question from the floor.
I don't know if I want to tackle that because I'm also a public servant, so I need to be duly cautious as well. I think the challenge is thinking about with technology what the counterfactual is. And so sometimes, even though there might be, you know, to some firms, they're sort of saying they're stealing our technology. Are they taking our market, or are they actually growing the overall size of the market? So there's a bit of a sort of sense to say, oh, well, they're using something very similar to us and they were incredibly successful. We would have been that successful. But often what you find is that it's a small perturbation to something that's created the success. So something that was actually, you know, sort of just didn't take off. Somebody else has a slightly new take on it. And to the person who didn't take off, it looks like their idea has been stolen and it's gone forward. But it actually wasn't going anywhere anyway as it was, and it's a slight perturbation. So these can be quite hard judgments to make. But I just also make the point that it's always been challenging for small firms to actually defend their IP. And many, many years ago, I was doing some work on cut flower markets and, you know, flower breeding and, you know, talking to a flower breeder in Thailand and said, well, don't you, you know, tie it up in plant breeding rights? And she said no, because the way she does it is it's secrecy. You get it up, you breed it up, you hit the market, you create a new fashion. And by the time everybody's caught up, you've hit the market with the next new fashion out there. And so, you know, so there's different techniques to actually, for firms to actually try and get the value out of their own innovation. But I'll leave it to others to sort of talk about the technicalities of these things.
Who wanted to dive in? Sally or Ian, did you want to comment on that as well?
Look, I'm going to say it's easier if, I think it's quite a lot easier if you're working with something which is a service or something which is quite dynamic. A digital product or a digital service is quite easy to take. That's the approach that Jenny's described. Much harder if you're building a widget. Widgets take a long time to reach market. They have a lot of intellectual property associated with them. And the stories that we've all heard of instant knockoffs or instant replication are really challenging. So I think the future is more and more about the service, and the future is more and more about the digital than the widget. There will always be a world market for widgets of some sort. More and more of the value is actually being created out of data. Even cars and certainly mobile phones, they become data generating sources. Even tractors now are data generating sources. They do the tractory bit, but a lot of the value is actually in the data. So I think the thinking about innovation and protecting innovation is ripe for change, because the world is becoming that digital, hyper-connected world of the 21st century that we've talked about for so long.
So I will add something to that, because I think there's a really interesting situation that you see in the developer community, right? And it's been going on for a long time, about developers who have built games, apps, things on top of other digital platforms out there. And then they're like, I built this, and then they copied it. And so my app is now, my income stream is now dried up. And I think there's another level of understanding that we need to do here. And it comes back to this cross-disciplinary skills and ethical behaviour. So we actually do have, you know, regulations, particularly in the US, but also in Australia, around anti-competitive behaviour. And, you know, what is right and what is wrong. And it's been really evident in, like, looking at some of this unfolding, that actually in some of these companies, employees are possibly at fault. You know, they have written emails, they have said things like, let's just copy this, it'll be faster for us. And so one of the things that we actually need to do is educate employees when that's not okay. It's not just about different, it's not just about foreign actors and nation states as actors in this place. It's actually corporates as well. And it's the individuals in those corporates who are not necessarily compliant with the laws in the country that they operate in, or even global law in that fact. And while there are training programs, and I had to sit through my recertification on multiple things every year for 13 years, and I can tell you all about privacy in multiple jurisdictions and product development, and PII and things like that. It's surprising to me that some people just don't recognise where they've actually crossed those boundaries and those lines. And I think part of that, again, comes back to these disciplinary silos that we educate people in. So our technologists and those that are creating, back in the day, and I think this is the experience in Australia, a lot of people used to view software engineers as people that are, over the other side of the fence. I direct what I want them to do and I just tell them, and they just sit there and they code and they spit it back to me and they give me the output. But actually what we're seeing in these tech companies and the companies that I've been a part of is they're actually led by engineers. They're led by engineering. Product design is not sales driven, it's actually engineering driven. And so the decisions and things there, if you have people that are only trained in that one discipline, we're actually missing some of these conversations. If they've never had to do, if you've never had to set up a clinical trial, if you've never been involved in medtech, right? If you're going to bring a new product to market in medtech, you have to go through a clinical trial process. It's very rigorous. It's a well-defined, clear pathway that you progress down. And the world is a lot better educated on this right now because we're all watching the clinical trial process with COVID, and we all know what a phase 1, phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trial is, which we might not have known 6 months ago. But in engineering, we haven't necessarily taught our engineers about that. So they don't know when they're butting up to these things because we haven't got those processes, and we actually don't teach them this in their computer science degrees at a global level. What are some of these things? So, fundamentally, I think it comes back down to sometimes it's potentially deliberate decision from the top, but other times it's actually, somewhere in middle management, somebody just doesn't know that they're doing the wrong thing and they're repeatedly doing the wrong thing. And it becomes a cultural behaviour that's not necessarily stamped out from the top down as well. So just a differing perspective on things that I think we need to be aware of that's happening in some of our corporates as well.
And thank you, Sally. And I think that actually really nicely rounded it up because we spoke about the challenges we faced at a macro level. And I think Francis really painted that in very clear terms for all of us. And what you've just done is also reminded us there's that meso and there's that micro in terms of the way we all act as individuals and within companies, which I know was part of the discussion tonight too. So thank you so much. I think we've done a bit of thinking about new institutions, Francis, following your invitation or provocation to do so as well, which I think is a really positive thing. On that note, just noting the time and noting you have to get away in Geneva as well, and thank you for making the time to join us. I want to pass over to Shane Barber, of course, the country director for Bird&bird, who have very kindly sponsored this evening's event. And Francis, just before you go, thank you so much for joining us. And I don't think it's remiss of me to say, thank you so much for your service. I think you do us all proud on the global stage, and we wish you all the very best for next steps. Thank you so much. And thank you to the panelists who've done a great job tonight.
Thank you so much, Jed, for that introduction. It's been an extraordinary evening. Thank you, everyone, for the contributions you've made. I think it's so important for us who are at the transaction front, even in global firms like Bird&bird, to lift up our eyes occasionally and perhaps more frequently now and scan. And if what we're seeing is elephants, that's great. If we're seeing grass, even all the more. So thank you all for the observations that you've made. Francis, a particular thank you to you. Thank you for your valuable time. I think you've brought to us this evening all of the great benefit of your vast experience over your 12 years in that role. I think Jenny described your presentation as a tour de force, and it certainly was. In your presentation, you looked at the trends in technology at the moment, the enormous investment in R&D that we're seeing, the rapid growth in patent applications, the multipolar competition that we're seeing, which is something quite new, and the speed at which things are changing. You looked at the signs of closure that we're seeing, which is disturbing, the decrease in foreign direct investment, the increase in protectionism, and these global value chains that took so long to create being dismantled. and the conjunction of economy and security. You've highlighted the risks for us of a decrease in openness and a fragmentation of universal technology. And also highlighted that key problem that the current frameworks that we have just aren't built for the environment that we're dealing with. And it's, I think, created challenges for all of us in our many different roles that we play as individual leaders in our economy and in our country. So thank you so much for that. And I think a key observation that all of us have seen is that COVID, rather than being the cause of these things, has really been an accelerator of some pre-existing conditions. And I think it's one of the great values that we're going to see from this very strange period in history, that we were able to make observations with greater clarity than perhaps we would have before. So that's great. To Jed, Sally Ann, Jenny and Ian, thank you so much for your time tonight and for your insightful observations. For us at Bird and Bird, it's always a great pleasure to be involved with the Australian Society for the Computers and the Law. Tonight is absolutely no exception. So thank you all very much. Marina, I think we perhaps go to you for a final comment.
Thank you so much, Shane. It has been a wonderful session. To all our speakers, thank you so much for giving so generously of your time and your expertise. I guess in typical style, I call the meeting officially closed, but we hope that the dialogue does continue and that we all make a positive difference as we move forward. Thank you again to all who attended, all who participated. It's been an absolute pleasure. Good night.